Good morning, everyone. It is Monica McDougal here from Attica First United Methodist Church, and it is a joy to be with you all for another one of our Sunday morning worship videos. This is the second week of Lent, and we move on from the story of Jesus being tempted in the wilderness to the story of Jesus calling his first disciples from the Gospel of Matthew. Specifically, our sermon this morning was inspired by Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 22. And I will be reading from the Common English Bible. Now, please prepare your heart and mind for worship this morning as we hear these words from the Gospel of Matthew. Now, when Jesus heard that John was arrested, he went to Galilee. He left Nazareth and settled in Capernaum, which lies alongside the sea in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali. This fulfilled what Isaiah the prophet said, "Land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, along the sea, across the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people who lived in the dark have seen a great light. And a light has come upon those who lived in the region and in shadow of death." From that time, Jesus began to announce, "Change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven." As Jesus walked alongside the Galilee Sea, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, throwing fishing nets into the sea because they were fishermen. "Come and follow me," he said, "and I will show you how to fish for people." Right away, they left their nets and followed him. Continuing on, he saw another set of brothers, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John. They were in a boat with Zebedee, their father, repairing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So last week we followed Jesus into the wilderness. After 40 days, Jesus outwits the tempter 3 times, remaining faithful to God. That story ends in triumph. Jesus wins against the tempter. Angels of God come and care for him, and he gets to leave the desert. Our story this morning picks up right where that story left off, when Jesus begins his public ministry for the first time. Our Lenten sermon series this year is titled The Objects of Lent. It's an exploration of Lenten themes through different everyday objects that appear in Jesus' story. Today, as Jesus calls those first disciples, our attention turns away from rocks and stones and towards fishing hooks and fishing nets. Last week in church, I promised the congregation that was gathered that I would share a bit about my personal experience with fishing in my sermon this morning. And I am going to do that, but to be honest with you, I do not have an extensive history of fishing. I know, shocking, right? I've only been fishing a handful of times, mostly in middle school. My middle school PE class did a fishing unit every year towards the end of the school year. We would take the bus to the city lake and spread out around the banks for some catch and release fishing. I remember particularly the fishing unit my 8th grade year very vividly. My friends and I set up at a picnic table on this little strip of land that juts out into the water a little bit. We had borrowed poles and lines and a small tackle box with hooks and lures. We were encouraged to dig up worms for bait, and we didn't catch anything. But to be honest with you, we weren't really trying to catch anything. I think we were just a bunch of 14-year-old girls that were excited to be out of school and able to chat without getting in trouble for it. But I remember sitting on the top of the picnic table with my best friend, Sarah, and we were looking around the lake watching some of our classmates at different points along this small city lake. And almost everyone from our class was in groups, chatting and laughing just like we were. But at the southwest corner of the lake, we noticed one of our classmates, this kid named Colby. He was fishing by himself. I watched as he baited his hook, cast into the water, and waited. He was watching the water closely and intently, and every once in a while he would adjust the line a little bit. And after what felt like a really long time, he reeled in a small fish. He unhooked it, tossed it back into the lake, and began again. And this kind of happened probably 3 times before Coach French blew the whistle, signaling that we needed to head towards the bus. When we all got back on the bus, they asked us how many fish we had caught. A few people had caught one, but most people hadn't caught anything. And I noticed that Colby remained quiet, and so I said, well, I think Colby caught at least 3. He smiled and nodded. So Coach French replied, wow, Colby, what was your secret? And Colby replied, well, I wasn't here to chit-chat. I was here to fish. The other day I was researching for this sermon and I took to Google and typed in the phrase, qualities of a good fisherman. Almost every article that I found listed the same 2 characteristics as the most important: patience and perseverance. And I understand why, because I honestly think that Colby pretty much perfectly embodied those traits that day we fished at the city lake. While the rest of us were goofing off and treating this fishing trip like it was social hour, Colby was quiet and focused. He didn't catch an abundance of fish, but that wasn't really the point. Colby wasn't there to beat a world record. He was just there to fish. Whenever I hear this passage of scripture where Jesus calls his first disciples, I'm fascinated by who Jesus chooses to begin his movement with. I'm a firm believer that who we choose to surround ourselves with says something about our priorities, right? Today, most movement leaders, when they're creating a group of people to be their first followers, they tend to focus primarily on recruiting people with resources, right? It seems that their primary concern is how they're going to fund their endeavor. And I get it. Things cost money. But Jesus doesn't begin his public ministry in this way. He doesn't start by calling bankers and businessmen and investors or millionaires. He doesn't even begin by calling doctors, lawyers, or priests. Rather, Jesus chooses to call 4 fishermen: Peter, Andrew, James, and John. So if my assertion that who we choose to surround ourselves with says something about our priorities, if that's correct, then what does Jesus' choice of fishermen say about this movement that he's just beginning? To begin answering that question, I think it might be helpful to know a little bit more about fishermen in the 1st century. So fishing at this time was an incredibly important part of the Galilean economy. That makes sense, right? Fishing brings in money, food, and trade goods, which were indispensable at this time. But fishermen in the 1st century Palestine, Galilee area region, they weren't independent business owners. So they weren't fishing just for their families or to make money for their families. Rather, they were contracted by the government. So all fishermen, even those who owned their own boats, were still expected to pay a large portion of their profits and give a large portion of their yield over to the government, sort of like a tax system, so that the government could then redistribute these goods and this money. Now, I think that would be a great system if the government officials who were tasked with redistributing this wealth were doing so with priority to those with the greatest need, making sure that people who were struggling to eat and make ends meet, that they were getting the goods and the resources that they needed. However, these officials, like King Herod, would often distribute a bulk of the profits and products to themselves while the poor still struggled to survive. And this was rather controversial with a lot of people, including John the Baptist. So at the beginning of our passage this morning, we're told that Jesus decides to begin his public ministry after learning that his friend and cousin, John the Baptist, had been arrested. John the Baptist was arrested and ultimately beheaded, not because he was a prominent religious figure who was baptizing people throughout the region, although they weren't super thrilled about that either. But rather, John the Baptist is executed because he was an outspoken critic of King Herod in the Roman Empire. John was a wildly popular figure. He had thousands of followers, and he was also unafraid to speak openly and forcefully about all the issues he had with the empire and the way they would abuse and mistreat their people. And John's followers listened to him, and they began to join a chorus of voices demanding change. This made John a massive threat to King Herod, and specifically to King Herod's power. So John had to be eliminated. Now, I think most people, if they heard that someone was arrested and executed for speaking out against the government, would probably go into hiding, choose to step back and be quieter about their political criticism and dissidence. But not Jesus. No, Jesus' response to John's arrest is to ramp up his work. Jesus gets more visible. Jesus gets louder. But Jesus also knows that this work will be exhausting and dangerous and difficult. It's work that he cannot and should not do alone. So he begins calling disciples. Now, choosing fishermen to be the first of these disciples is actually a really smart choice on a purely practical basis. Fishermen had resources and skills that would serve Jesus well. They had access to boats, which allowed them to make quick getaways whenever the Roman officials started to crack down on them. Because they were skilled in fishing, they could provide food for eating and trading, which would help with the group's survival and growth. Of course, there's many stories in which the disciples have some fish. Jesus multiplies this fish in order to feed lots of people, right? So we know that having fishermen helped supply food. But I think Jesus is less concerned with what Peter, Andrew, James, and John had access to, and more about who they were as people, what their work as fishermen, how that affected their personality and their work ethic. Patience and persistence. Those were the two qualities that all of the internet articles said were most important in a fisherman. Patience and persistence. Unsurprisingly, those are also two of the most important, if not the most important qualities in a disciple. Fishermen can't get discouraged when they have a low yield, and they can't get bored and distracted. Fishing is a lot of waiting around, right? Waiting for something to bite, waiting to go check your nets and traps. If you have a bad day and you fail to catch anything of substance, you don't have the luxury of throwing in the towel and giving up, because the only way you're going to survive in that business is to go back out there the next day and try again. You have to be patient and persistent in order to make a living off of fishing. But fishermen are also hardworking and observant. They are used to long, hard days toiling under the sun. And they know the importance of understanding the environment in which you're fishing, right? That you can't fish the same way in two different places. That temperature of the water, the weather, the activity around the lake or sea, that all of that impacts your ability to catch fish. So this knowledge and skill would no doubt serve them well when they start fishing for people, right? So Jesus knows that in order for this movement to survive, he needs people who work hard, who are patient and persistent, people who know how to fail but keep trying, people who know how to adapt, people who know how to look at an environment and adjust their message so that it is received in the right way by the right people. So fishermen were just the type of guys that Jesus knew he needed on his team. But while Jesus knew who he wanted to call, those disciples still had a choice whether or not they were going to answer. And it was a tough choice, no doubt, because abandoning their jobs as fishermen in order to join this movement, that was risky. Not only did it mean that their families would lose income and access to food, it also meant that they would be deliberately and actively defying the Roman Empire. Again, these people are contracted by the government. They are expected to go out and catch fish and give a large portion of that back to the government. So they would be violating that contract, being in direct defiance of the empire. And they knew the dangers of this. I mean, look what happened to John the Baptist. But they chose to follow Jesus anyway, and at a great personal cost. Because remember that all but one of the disciples that are left when Jesus ascends to heaven after the resurrection are ultimately executed by the Roman Empire for the work that they do on behalf of Jesus and his movement. So this is a huge decision with life-altering implications for them. But they make it. They make it anyway. They choose to follow Jesus. But why? Why do they choose to follow him? Well, I think that they knew that the potential reward was far greater and far outweighed the likely risk. Theologian Warren Carter explains this further by saying, quote, "These men are fishermen embedded in the imperial economy. Rome asserts control over the land and the sea, their production and the transportation and marketing of their yields with contracts and taxes. But Jesus shows up and interrupts these men's lives. He calls them to a different loyalty and a different way of life. He creates a new community and gives them a new mission, to fish for people. This summons exhibits God's empire at work, the light shining in the darkness of Roman-ruled Galilee." End quote. So friends, in other words, the Roman Empire is one that will neglect and batter and abuse these fishermen and their people day after day with no remorse, because they view these people purely in terms of what they can do for the empire. But God's empire, the empire that they will swear allegiance to by choosing to follow Jesus, that is an empire that calls them by name, that sees them as beloved children of God, an empire that is set not on their exploitation, but on their liberation of both them and their people. Jesus brings good news to the poor, and there hasn't really been any good news from Rome for their entire lives. So when we put it that way, the choice seems rather simple. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they choose to follow Jesus because, quite frankly, they have nothing left to lose, but everything to gain. The choice to follow Jesus for you and I may not be as scary, right? Choosing to follow Jesus in the United States of America rarely ends in being arrested or murdered, right? Not in a long time, if ever. Of course, that can happen in certain places around the world, but it's not really a reality that you or I face. But choosing to follow Jesus is important nonetheless. Being a follower of Christ is not simply a title that we get to claim. It is inherently transformational. Being a follower of Jesus should change everything. It should change everything about the way you view yourself, the way you view others, the way you view the world. It should make you a more loving, a more just, and a more merciful person. So if you call yourself a Christian, but you have not been transformed by love, justice, and mercy, then frankly, your conversion is still a work in progress. You haven't fully let go of your old life, your old ways. You still have one hand holding on to that net. You haven't fully followed Jesus. While our world today looks a lot different than it did in the first century Palestine, it is still a world that is in desperate need of some good news. It is in desperate need of people who truly and completely follow Jesus. It is a world that needs light and liberation and love. And this is not always easy work. It is work that requires patience and persistence. And it's work that requires us not to get discouraged or distracted. And it is easy to get discouraged, right? We look around our sanctuaries and we see fewer people than were once there, and we fear that everything is falling apart. But even though our church looks different now than it did 15 or 50 years ago, our mission has not changed. God has disrupted our lives, is disrupting our lives, and calling us to go out and fish for people. Now, let me be clear. This doesn't mean that God is telling us to focus solely on recruiting new members, of putting butts in pews and money in plates. Growing in numbers and givers is, of course, a reality that we have to face, but it is not the crux of our mission. When the fishermen choose to drop their nets and follow Jesus, they choose God over Rome. They choose to stop fishing the waters for goods to hand over to Rome, an empire that will exploit it for their own gain. Instead, these men choose to fish the land for people who were lost and hopeless and scared. Their job was to cast their nets around those human beings and bring them into the light, bring them into the love. Peter, James, Andrew, and John, they answer the call not because they want to see more people in the temple, but because they want to see a world transformed. They know that the good news that Jesus brings is news that will set all of their people free. I think we need to be more like Peter and Andrew and James and John, right? And I wonder what that would look like. What would it look like for us to fish for people in our community? What would it look like if each and every one of us went out and made a deliberate effort to show people what it means that we're followers of Christ, not just to tell people, but to embody it? How can we bring justice and mercy and love into the community and state and world through our actions? Like Peter, Andrew, James, and John, God has given us a choice. We can choose to stay where we are in life as usual. We can keep clinging to our nets, working for people and systems and structures that will never care about us. Or we can take a leap of faith. We can take that big risk and choose a new empire. Swear our allegiance to God, turn to Jesus, and follow him fully, helping to bring other people into the light and into the love. That's our mission. It is the mission that each and every one of us is called to take on. So there's only one question remaining. Will you answer that call? Amen. Next week, we continue into week 3 of Lent. So I'm excited as we continue on our Lenten journey together. I want to leave you with some words of sending forth before you go out about the rest of your week. Please receive these words of benediction. Go now to follow the way of Jesus and be fishers of men. See others as he did. Dare to give freely as he did, and to love unconditionally as he did. Go, embraced by the source of life, love, and hope, in the company of the word of life, and encouraged by the breath of life. Amen.